Before you listen to this podcast episode of Health Gig, please know that there are some topics and language that some listeners may find triggering in this episode. So please be warned. And now, Health Gig.
The way we take care of ourselves is ever evolving. And what we know for sure is that our mind and spirit are linked to our physical body, and that our wellness seems to extend into our communities and the planet we all share. It is very, very clear that wellness is interconnected. We love spending time with you to explore and practice the breakthroughs, the insights, and the passions of incredible people helping us all see the world in a whole new light. This is Health Gig.
On today's Health Gig, we welcome comedian Paul Gilmartin, who's also the founder and creator of the Mental Illness Happy Hour podcast. Paul's hope is that the Mental Illness Happy Hour podcast and the website that he's created will give people a place to connect, smile, and feel the return of hope. Paul, welcome to Health Gig. Really looking forward to this conversation.
That's a lot of pressure. I don't know if I can deliver.
No pressure, no pressure. Can you describe what the Mental Illness Happy Hour is and how can people find it? Because it is really a remarkable podcast.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. It's a weekly audio-only podcast. There's 720 episodes, 720 episodes. It was started in March of 2011. And the podcast is a place for honesty about all the battles in our heads. You know, I'll say in the introduction, sometimes a place for honesty about all the battles in our heads from mentally, I'm blanking on it now.
It's okay.
I haven't had my coffee yet. You know, we talk about mental health issues, sexual dysfunction, negative thinking, trauma, you name it. It started out, when I first started doing the podcast, it started out as a place to just talk about mental health struggles with creative people. Because I thought, I'm just going to interview friends, etc. Because I was kind of interested in the relationship between depression and creativity. I've suffered with depression probably since I was a child. I asked my psychiatrist one time, I said, what is it that I actually have? And he said, treatment-resistant depression due to childhood adversity. And so that's on my business card. And my phone number right underneath it.
Right. And can you describe that? Can you describe what that means? Your diagnosis?
I had never thought of my childhood as being adverse, but that's kind of the nature because I was raised in a upper middle class home, physically safe, not a lot of drama, a lot of tension underneath the surface. You know, a dad who was a closet alcoholic, but high functioning insurance executive. I think the trauma is more from having a parent who is a closet alcoholic and certainly does cause issues because they're not there. They may physically be there, but they're not invested. And my dad I just remember he was kind of there when I was a little kid, and then it was almost like he just floated away, like mentally he just floated away. And he did eventually get sober. But I think the real adversity was my mom, and she is still alive. We don't have a relationship. She had her own battles, terrible, terrible childhood, lots of abandonment, and it really affected her deeply. And she was just really creepy with me. A lot of kind of covert incest stuff that a kid wouldn't go, oh, you know, that's sexual. But as an adult, you know, I've had therapists say you would have been removed from the home if they had known what was happening. And that kind of blew me away because one of the things that survivors do, especially if something isn't really overt, is we will blame ourselves or we will minimize it or compartmentalize it as, oh, that's just a one-off. And it wasn't until I looked at the pattern as a whole that it hit me. And when it did hit me, and this was maybe a year into doing the podcast.
Oh, wow. It wasn't until then.
It wasn't until then. Oh. Yeah. And I'd been sober from drugs and alcohol for, I don't know, maybe a decade. At that point, I'm 21 years sober now from drugs and alcohol.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And I had been in a support group for intimacy issues, and it was there that I really began to uncover. And what began the journey of it, the reason I got into this support group was, I'd been 7 years sober at that point when I started going to this support group, because I just felt like my heart was totally disconnected from my genitals. I just could not be present. It was so, and the only time I could be present was when I was cheating. And I did not want to live the rest of my life being like that. I was married. I was ashamed of who I was, living with the secrets of, when I was a touring stand-up comedian, when I would go on the road, that's where I would do a lot of the acting out, the one-night stands. It went away for my first 6 years of sobriety. The urge to do that when I would go on the road was gone. And then it started coming back, and it alarmed me, the desire. And so I was like, I've got to do something because I don't want to be that guy again. And so I started going to this support group somebody recommended. I'd shared in a meeting, I'm having these urges and they're scaring the shit out of me. I don't know what to do. And this person said, hey, check out this support group. I go to it as well. And it was a lifesaver. But all of this is to say, as I started going there and I began looking at my pattern of behavior, I realized, oh, I'm afraid of women, and that by objectifying and sexualizing them, it's a way of me controlling them, taking their humanity away so that they can't hurt me. Then I began to, as I stopped doing the objectifying, etc., all of this pain, all of this discomfort started coming out, all of this sadness, all of this anger. But I got back into my body. I wasn't numb anymore as all of this pain started getting released. It was then that I could listen to my body, because I wasn't numb, and I could listen to my body when I would be around people and go, oh, I don't like this person. I don't want to be in this room. And I began to listen to it. And to not put myself in situations where I was being drained. And the person that I began to realize that the most with was my mother. I would feel so exhausted being around here. I would feel so sad. And the other thing I began to learn in the support group was to advocate for my needs, is to say, can you please not touch me that way? Can you please not talk to me like I'm your husband, etc. One of the things that my mom would do growing up and to this day is she has a really hard time accepting that somebody has a differing opinion on something than her. And so she will wear you down trying to get you to change your opinion on something. And I'm talking about something that doesn't even matter. And she was doing this one day, and I said, can you please stop? Stop. Let's just agree to disagree. And so she stopped, and then just like it hadn't even happened, she was like, oh, let's read some spiritual literature together in this book. And I couldn't at that point because I was still riled up from her badgering me. And I said, Mom, look, I know that you want to have a closer relationship with me, but sometimes I don't feel safe around you. And it was like she was looking through me at something behind me, like this glazed over look in her eyes, like she wasn't even there when I said this. And she didn't want to know why, no apology, nothing, and then just went on talking about something else. That for me was a huge moment in me advocating for myself, because I realized when you advocate for your boundaries, for your needs, for what it is that you're feeling with another person, you give them an opportunity to reveal their character and how much they care or respect you. And that, to me, was one of the things that led to me saying it's not mentally healthy for me to have a relationship with this person anymore. You know, my ex-wife said to me, I've never met anybody who tried so hard to make a relationship work. Please stop. Please stop trying. She told me the first day that she met my mom, she said, she creeps me out the way she talks to you, the way she touches you. And I was like, oh, you just don't like my mom. You just think she's annoying. And I buried it for 20 years. So when I did break down, when I finally was able to call what happened to me a form of incest, my then wife said, I've been waiting 20 years for you to say this, but this is what survivors do. Is we minimize it, or we blame ourselves, or we say, well, this didn't happen. You know, rape survivors will say, well, I had a drink, or it was a date. How could it be that? Or I know this person, or whatever it is. The culpability of the other person is not as important as the feelings that we are left with by the event, because that's the thing that we need to process. People will often say, well, it couldn't have been rape because in a court of law, I wouldn't have a case. That doesn't matter. You're not processing a court of law inside your soul. You're processing the feeling that was left with you, which is, I'm a thing. I don't matter to this person. And for children, it sends the message, I'm not safe. The world is not safe. And it's much easier to say, I enjoyed it, or it was my fault, than to say, I am in the care of an unsafe person for another 10 years. Because I remember burying those thoughts when I was a kid and just pushing them aside because it's too heavy of a thought. So these are some of the things that we talk about with the podcast. And the thing that led me to start the podcast was in 2010, against the advice of my psychiatrist, I decided I'm going to try going off my meds. And I'd done that a couple of times before. And it was always, can we swear on here?
Yeah, you can go ahead and swear.
Okay, yeah. It was always a show when I would go off them. But I thought, well, I cleaned my diet up. Maybe that's the reason I've been depressed my whole life. And he was like, please don't go off your meds. And I was like, yeah, all right, sure. I know what I'm talking about. I was pre-med. So,
Right. I saw that. And then from pre-med, you became a comedian, but okay.
So I went off my meds. And for the first couple of months, I felt amazing. So I was like, I don't really need them anymore. And then the depression fooled me. It creeped back in. And I thought that my life really did suck, that my life really was over, that I would never feel joy again, and that it wasn't something inside me, that it was my external world that I just couldn't feel. And I suddenly realized, after a month of feeling suicidal, oh my God, it's the depression. Went back on my meds, and within a week, I was feeling fine again. And I thought, holy shit, I've been under the care of a psychiatrist, in therapy, in support groups. I believe that mental illness is a real thing. And I was fooled by it. And I thought a podcast would be a great forum to talk about the cunning nature of mental illness. That's what led me to start the podcast, because whenever I'd seen mental health portrayed on TV, in a magazine article, how can you talk about it in 5 minutes? I need to hear somebody's story. A lot of the stuff that was out there would be too academic, or kind of too new agey, or kind of Dr. Phil, somebody barking at somebody else about what they need to do. I thought, the power of stories that I've experienced in my support groups has changed my life. Somebody just sharing their story, I remember things way more than somebody saying 1 in 5 people. I never remember any of that stuff. But when somebody says, I wanted to drive my van off a cliff because I thought I was a terrible father and I couldn't stop using opiates, I remember that. I remember things like that. The power of vulnerability, like Brene Brown talks about, that was everything for me. I was new to vulnerability in 2010 because I'd been in the intimacy support group for a year or two at that point, and I was making these leaps and bounds of insights about how numb I was and what a user I had been, and how much I needed to change my behavior, and how much of that was going to require me to really take a hard look at myself and to not simply say, well, my mom did these things to me, so that's why this stuff happened. Yeah, sure, there's a correlation, but I have to take responsibility. My childhood was not my fault, but my adulthood is my responsibility. And I had been a very, very irresponsible adult. You know, I'd hurt people, I'd used people, and that's a hard thing. That's a hard thing to look at, especially if you grew up in a home where mistakes were weaponized, you know, where they were leveraged in the future. I know a lot of people experience that in current relationships, and vulnerability addresses that, you know, but we got to own our shit. We got to be willing to take a hard look at ourselves. And I learned that in support groups. I did not come to that on my own. I had to see other people talking about it and how they would apologize and not say, yeah, but you did this. To just say, hey, I'm sorry, I raised my voice, or as we say, clean up our side of the street. I began to realize that instead of feeling weak, in the beginning I might have felt a little bit weak doing that, but the overwhelming emotion was one of freedom, of being able to lay my head on my pillow. I have, in sobriety, had to make hundreds of amends to people. That might be an exaggeration. Dozens and dozens of amends. I play hockey, recreational hockey, and that's the litmus test for me, where I am today in my spirituality, my emotional temperament, because all of my buttons get pushed. It was really hard to get my dad's attention, and winning at sports was one of the biggest ways to get his attention. And so when I'm losing or playing badly at hockey, or somebody disrespects me, my central nervous system feels like my life is in danger. It's like my head just feels like it's going to explode. I feel this rage inside of me, this sense of I want to control everybody on my team. I start yelling, skate harder, do this. You know, if somebody on the other team disrespects me, sometimes I'll fight. And it's been a couple of years since I have done that. But just watching myself in the penalty box screaming these horrible things at the other player, I've had to look at that and make those apologies. I have had to make so many apologies, but my point is this, is I feel peace after I do that. That guy who I wanted to kill 10 minutes earlier, when I go up to him, pull him aside and say, hey, I'm sorry, what I did was not okay. I was really frustrated and I shouldn't have done that. And 99.9% of the time, they will say, it's cool, man. It's cool. It's hockey, you know, and then we laugh about it. And then I feel a little bit of a bond with this guy the next time we play each other. There's a guy who I hated on this team that we play. He and I chatted one time for like 5 minutes outside the game. And now there's none of this cheap shotting each other. We'll actually reach down and help lift the other guy off the ice and call each other by our first name. And I love that feeling. In many ways, that is how I've had to learn to cope with life. And that doesn't mean being a doormat. I still advocate for my needs, or at least know that I need to, as uncomfortable as it can be. Here's an example of how bad I was at advocating for myself. This is probably 25 years ago. There were some workmen in my house. They were putting a new floor in, and I turned the corner, walked into the room, and this was 25 years ago, this guy is stealing my CDs. He's putting them in his work bag. And I was so afraid of him feeling uncomfortable, I turned around and pretended that I didn't see it. And I let him take them. Today would be completely different. I would say, put the CDs back, get your shit, and get out of here. And then I would call his boss. But that's how much I wanted to protect the other person. But the cost of that is you walk through life as a child, acting out. For me, that's what it was. I could never relate that if you can't act like an adult in all areas of your life, you're going to act like a child in another area of your life. You're going to throw a tantrum, or you're going to eat cake for dinner, whatever our thing is.
So now, where are you? So you're feeling strong? You're feeling free? You're on your meds and you plan to
Mhm.
stay on your meds?
I do. I do. Yeah, I would love to go off them because I don't like big pharma. I don't trust them, but they're the best option for me. But I'm always trying new things. Oh my God,
Yeah.
I've tried so many modalities, and some of them have helped, some have not helped because my depression is fairly treatment resistant. I've tried transcranial magnetic stimulation, I've done ketamine therapy, I've done neurofeedback. I've tried so many things. And, the things I have to do just to get to the starting line are I have to get rest. I have to avoid processed sugar and flour. I have to not have toxic people in my life. I have to pray, meditate, stretch, exercise, keep my side of the street clean. I have to have some type of spirituality, being of service, believing in something greater than myself. Those are all things. If I don't do these, I get into fear. And when I'm afraid, I act like a little boy. I'll lash out. I'll make it all about me. I mean, I make it all about me anyway, but I'll make it even more about me.
Because you're you're scared, you're protecting yourself. Are you active in 12 step?
I am.
Is that a big part? Is that the
It's
groups
a
that you're
really
referring
big
to?
part of my life.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say 80% of my friends and people I talk to on a daily basis are people from my support groups. Yeah.
The support groups and
Mhm.
being part of something that you can talk and be real. And that's what you wanted to offer through this podcast. You wanted a place where people could come and listen and know that they have a place.
Exactly. I say that it's not the doctor's office, it's the waiting room. Because I was always
Mm,
struck when I would be in the waiting room to see the psychiatrist, none of us would make eye contact. And
right.
I was like, I would love the podcast to be like if that waiting room, if we knew each other and we were cracking up jokes and laughing and none of us felt shame. That's what I wanted to create. I did not and do not want the podcast to be a place for people to solve their problems. I want to be the cheerleader for the people in the trenches who are the therapists, the social workers, the psychiatrists. I wanted to model through people sharing their stories how important vulnerability and honesty can be. A place where you can hear people say things out loud, where someone listening would say, oh my God, I do the same thing, or I feel or think the same thing, and I can't believe that person said it out loud. And I get emails from people who are like, I started therapy after listening to your podcast. And some of them are like, I still haven't found a good therapist. The first 3 sucked. But some of them will be like, I have a great therapist. And, or I started going to a support group and I'm a year sober now. But a big part of the podcast, half of it is me interviewing a person, sometimes a mental health professional, sometimes a friend, sometimes a celebrity. The other half of the podcast is me reading surveys that have been filled out anonymously
Can you
on
tell
our
us
website.
about that? Yeah.
They're on a variety of topics, from things like happy moments to bittersweet things. We call them awfulsome moments because it's awful and awesome at the same time.
Mm,
Something might be really f***ed up, but in hindsight, with a couple of years between you and the event, you're like, oh my God, that's so darkly funny. And those are some of my favorite ones. There's one called Struggle in a Sentence, where people will try to encapsulate. For instance, this person just filled out a survey last week that I love, and they said, having bipolar is like depression with glitter. Because, the bipolar, the depression sucks, but also the mania can be like, ooh, this is really exciting, until, of
right.
course, it,
Until it's not. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
turns on you and you got to make apologies and you've spent $20,000 on your credit card because you think every idea you had is amazing.
Right.
Another person filled out Struggle in a Sentence. This person who struggles with anorexia, they said, nothing tastes as good as skinny feels. That's the Struggle in a Sentence survey. And then probably the mother lode of the surveys is one called the Shame and Secrets survey. And like 10,000 people have filled this out, and it's a pretty extensive survey. What are the darkest things you think about? What are the darkest things you've done or that have happened to you? Have you ever been the victim of sexual abuse? If you're comfortable, share what happened. What are your most powerful sexual fantasies? What have you never said to someone that you would like to? What, if anything, do you wish for? What, if anything, would you like to say to someone who shares your thoughts or feelings or experiences? Have you ever experienced physical or emotional abuse? If you're comfortable, can you describe that? And as I said, 10,000 people have filled this out, and I've read probably 8,000 of them so far. I've got another couple thousand to go. I could only take in so many, and so I fell like 4 years behind in keeping up with them. And so I had to kind of leapfrog over 4 years of them to get to today, but I'm going to go back and get back into those other ones because they can be so dark and so heavy. But I've also learned so much about the things that people never, ever talk about. It's been illuminating. It's been heartbreaking. I've learned so much about sexuality and the relationship between trauma and sexual fantasy. When people can be anonymous and really share, and for many people, it's the first time they've ever formed the thought when they're filling the survey out, and they will often say, I'm crying as I'm writing this, because they've never had to put into words, here is this thing that I've never taken the time to express.
And I guess what your commitment is that you're giving them space to be heard. Is that
Yeah,
what?
I'd like to think so. Yeah.
Yeah, that they're
But I'm
heard.
also interested in knowing it. So it's also
Right.
a lot of people with antisocial personality disorder have been coming to the podcast and filling out surveys. There's a Discord server with about 10,000 people on it for people with ASPD. And somebody posted that the podcast was a safe and respectful place for talking about that. I've been thrilled that people have been sharing about this thing that we don't hear a lot of. What we do hear is the label of this person's a sociopath, and we equate it with they're not human, they're a killing machine, you know, they destroy everything, et cetera, and it's such a loaded, misused term. And people with ASPD who have been filling out these surveys have given me and the listeners a glimpse into the totality of what it might be like for a person who has this, what their desires and their needs are, what their struggles are, and more importantly, how marginalized they feel. They said, can you imagine if every time you see somebody who's done something horrible, they use the word for the condition that I have?
Ah, so what does ASPD stand for?
Antisocial personality disorder.
Antisocial personality disorder.
And it's kind of an umbrella term, and people will agree or disagree on what sociopathy means, what psychopathy means, where they overlap. It's the DSM tries to make sense of it, but it's kind of an ongoing thing of there being any kind of consensus on what terms should be applied, what should be gotten rid of, etc. And people feel very, very strongly about it, which to me can be a bit scary as a host because I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but I also don't want to treat people with kid gloves if there's a truth that I want to share or my opinion that I want to share. And I've f***ed up in the past and using terms that people took exception to, and as a people pleaser, that's terrifying for me. But the podcast, I think, is a good place to model what f***ing up looks like. I've f***ed up so many times on the podcast and have had to say, oh my God, I just used this word. You know, I used some words beginning of doing the podcast that I didn't even realize were transphobic. And then people wrote in and they're like, hey, that word you used is not okay. And I had no idea. So now I've got to address that on the podcast and try to learn moving forward. I still sometimes struggle with forgetting to use the right pronoun with somebody, with people I love. For a people pleaser, you know, you feel like you dropped a nuclear bomb on them.
Right.
But I get to, on the podcast, I can make an episode as long as I want. I can deal with any of these issues, explain them. Nobody can edit it out. I really like that part of podcasting, is learning so much, even if it's sometimes about what a dummy I can be.
What do you say? Because I listened to a couple of what you've talked about, and I listened to the one about your being interviewed about your story. And you were saying, you know, I'm sick of it. I'm sick of talking about this, and I want to talk about something else. How do you do that? Like, how do you change your story when it's been so formative in not a great way?
There's, I guess, two things I keep in mind if I'm sharing my story. One is that it might help somebody. The other, at least in terms of doing podcast interviews, I used to take any and all because I had the bandwidth to do it, and I don't do it as much today because I started getting burned out talking about my childhood. And it's not that it's traumatizing for me. I actually feel almost indifferent. When I
Now,
first
yeah.
started talking about it, it was very activating. Sometimes I would get high talking about it, which was very confusing. And I don't mean high like drunk but
Right.
like adrenaline, like hands shaking. And sometimes there would even be like a sexual component, which I felt tremendous shame about. And I realized that that can be something for survivors, especially when they're first recounting things that have happened to them. And it wouldn't be when I would be sharing it with men, but if there were women there, I think there was a part of me that wanted them to come comfort me. And then my fantasy would be that then it would become sexual. All these mixed up,
Yeah,
crossed
things that
wires. But
just come in,
one of the fantasies I used to have as a child, I remember it as early as first grade, and I used to always wonder, why do I have this urge? And it was for me, it would be when I was on the playground and I went to Catholic grade school, and it would be for an older girl to come and hug me and for me to cry and her to just hold me. And I didn't know why that was. And of course, now I look back and it's like, I wanted to feel safe. I wanted a mother figure. And when I first began telling my story, I think there was a version of that in telling the story, but it also had these crossed wires of, and then I want it to become sexual.
Why do you think you went into comedy? Were you funny or did you just find it interesting? Or I know you must have been funny because you were successful, but what made you maybe pursue that? You were pre-med. What was in you? Do you think this was something that just, I don't know, it was a way to do what?
I had always wanted to be a comedian. The first time I heard George Carlin, I think I was like, I don't know, maybe 8 years old, and I heard his album Class Clown, and it was life-changing. On TV, when there would be a stand-up comedian, I noticed when I was a young teenager, everybody in the room is laughing and I am not. And I realized, oh, I'm studying this person. And I think also being the person who took on the role of, I'm going to release the family tension by making a joke, or I'm going to release the tension by somebody picking on me because I'm short. I'm going to do it first by bringing attention to myself, but in a way that I can control. And I think it was a way of getting my dad's attention. And my mom was always, the picture that I painted her thus far has been a bit one-dimensional. There are so many great things about my mom that I miss. She encouraged my creativity. She saw parts of me that other people didn't see. And it's heartbreaking that mentally I can't handle having a relationship with her today, but she encouraged me. When I said, I'm thinking about doing this, she's like, yes, yes. So when I changed my major from pre-med to theater, it was because my roommate at college said, oh, hey, there's a stand-up comedy competition coming up. You should try it. And so I took an acting class to overcome my fear of being up in front of people. And I fell in love with it. And I just felt like this is something I want to do for the rest of my life. And so I changed my major, and my parents were supportive. I think my dad was very worried, but they were supportive. And I'm very lucky to have that. And I think it's important, if people share about a childhood where there was neglect or trauma, one of the questions in the survey is, have you had any positive experiences with the abuser? And there were so many in my life. So many in my life. And I think for a lot of people, that can be true. That's the hardest part to navigate.
And so now are you doing comedy at all, or are you pretty focused on the podcast?
Pretty much. I'm mostly focused on furniture making. It's been a hobby of
Oh,
mine for 20 years. And
what kind of furniture?
I would say mid-century modern. Some of it is my own design. I have an Instagram handle. It's
Wow. Yes, please share.
MIHH, as in mental illness happy hour, MIHH furniture. It is my happy place. My garage is a wood shop. And
Oh,
so
that's awesome.
Yeah,
to be
so
able
that's
to
kind
do
of
that.
where all my free time, and that's one of the things I realized in recovery, especially in the intimacy support group, is it's not a program of deprivation. Don't go do this and just sit at home, with your fist clenched, being in agony. Find something that you love, especially something that you would love to have done as a kid. One time, our support group, we went trampolining.
Oh, that's awesome. That's
A
so
bunch of
great.
people in their 30s and 40s and 50s just jumping around like kids, and then having pizza afterwards. And yeah, part of it felt kind of lame, like, oh my God, how pathetic are we? But it's important to not judge yourself and to say, what is it do you love? Do you love ice cream and you don't have an eating disorder? That's not a problem. If you can have just one, go have an ice cream cone.
Right. Oh, I love that. Like not judging. And in those moments, I guess the shame is gone because living in the shame is,
It's
uh,
exhausting, and
it's
it becomes your
exhausting.
normal. It's like a water for fish. You're so used to that voice in your head, and generally that voice is somebody else's voice from childhood. But it's important to remember that, especially if you're dealing with an addiction, it's not a life of deprivation, it's a life of healthy abundance. But
Mm.
finding those healthy things, sometimes they might not jolt you the way a shot of heroin did or a pint of Guinness. But over the long term, you know, life, instead of becoming jagged peaks and valleys, is more like gently rolling hills. And that's been my experience. Have there been times in my sobriety and recovery where I've been suicidal? Yeah. Even on my meds, not where I'm making a plan or thinking, what am I going to do it with, but where I don't want to get out of bed, where I'm not happy to be alive. And that's a terrible place to be, when you don't want to die, but you don't want to be alive. And I think that's kind of the wheelhouse for the podcast in many ways, because I'd say 90% of the people that are regular listeners deeply know that feeling of, there is something missing that other people seem to get that I don't. I'm not getting through either my own shortcomings or no fault of my own.
I would imagine all of us suffer in some way of some addiction, of some taste of whatever, or depression or sadness. But what would you want from the people that aren't on medications and can live their lives maybe in a way that they don't need this kind, you know what I mean? Like
Hmm.
they're not labeled depressed, they're not labeled anxious, they're just healthy. People that, seemingly are living their lives and they don't really deal with depression
Oh,
or
I
have
got
people,
you.
you know what I mean? Like,
Yes. If you're going to ask somebody how they're doing, really ask them. That's one of the things in my support group. When I say to somebody, how you doing? I'll say, and is that really how you're doing? And if somebody who is a friend asks me how I'm doing, I'll say, do you really want to know? And then I will tell them, I'm not happy to be alive, or I'm not feeling joy, or whatever it is that I'm going through. And so for the person who isn't suffering, I would say, be prepared for a real answer if you're going to ask somebody how they're doing. The other thing I would say is, don't try to fix people. Sometimes people just want to be heard and seen. And especially in a marriage, men tend to want to try to fix things. And it took me 15 years of a 28-year marriage to realize she doesn't want to be fixed. She just wants me to listen.
we all want to be heard.
Yeah.
For
And to
sure.
people who are struggling, the most important thing, two most important things, are to be open-minded and to keep seeking. I'm still seeking. I still want to feel better. I still have the ups and downs. And I will have to do it the rest of my life, because sometimes a certain med will stop working. Or, all of a sudden, one of the things I also do is I make music. And I haven't picked up a guitar in probably 2 years. I don't know where that passion went. Is it going to come back? I have no idea. I'm just glad I have something right now that I feel passionate about. Somebody was asking me, one of the things we tell ourselves, those of us who deal with depression, is one of the things we will call ourselves is lazy. And I've replaced that word with uninspired, because when I'm inspired by something, I work my ass off at it. I will be in the wood shop making furniture until I can't stand anymore, till my legs are aching. That's not a lazy person. But I have a pile of papers that I've yet to sort through on the kitchen table that is a foot tall. I've been putting off getting my taxes together. Is that lazy? I don't know. I would like to say that I'm inspiration driven. So find something that inspires you. Yeah, take care of the adult that you need to take care of, but find something that inspires you and keep looking. And don't let anybody tell you that's stupid. Generally, people who don't have any hobbies, or I should say, I see this a lot with people who don't have any hobbies or don't know what they want, is a lot of them were told as children, that's stupid, or that's not going to make any money, or why would you do that, or you're not good at that.
Right, right, right.
That voice is the biggest battle. That is one of the biggest battles. And if we don't open up to people, we don't know what that voice is saying because we believe it. It's like a background noise that's always there. You forget it's there. But if you have to share your story with somebody and say what's really going on, you might be able to say, oh, and my brain is telling me. That's the phrase I use a lot, is somebody will say, how are you doing? I'll say, my life's great, but my perception is the problem. Because that voice tells me I'm lazy, I blew it, I'm not doing enough.
Right, and you realize it's not you.
Yes. It's like an abusive relationship that I can't leave. You know what I mean?
No, I
the
do
voice in my
understand.
head.
Yeah.
If I always say, if we talk to other people the way we talk to ourselves, they would get a restraining order.
It's so true. Paul, this has just been such a great conversation. Is there anything else you'd like our listeners to know or share with them?
Just keep seeking. Just keep seeking. Never give up, and put the crystal ball away. It's broken. I pick mine up every day, and it's never right, and it's never helpful. Instead of focusing on what's going to go wrong, think that there might be some good surprises for you. You might meet some new people. You might have some new experiences that are awesome. And so consider that. If you're going to look in your crystal ball, consider that that might be a part of it.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for coming on. So appreciate it.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you for joining us on Health Gig. We loved having you with us. We hope you'll tune in again next week. In the meantime, be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast and follow us on healthgigpod.com. I'm Tricia.
And I'm Doro.
Be well.